Hey friends, welcome back to the channel. My name is Sanji. In today's video, we're going to talk about that incredibly exciting topic of emergency funds. Now, this is something that I often say to people when they want to start their journey on personal finance, sorting out their finances, or getting started in investing in the share market. You need to have an emergency fund. So in this video, I will go through why you need an emergency fund, some examples where you would need one, how much money you need to have in your emergency fund, how you go about building your emergency fund, and some tips and tricks on how you could maintain your emergency fund. I think the key thing there is just don't forget to put money back in after you take money out. Quick reminder, this should not be considered financial advice. You should definitely speak to a financial advisor, read The Barefoot Investor, go to moneysmart.com, do all that kind of stuff. This is just me explaining, I guess, my experience when it comes to emergency funds and some of the things I've seen out there. So why do you need an emergency fund? Well, it comes down to a couple of things. First of all, one of the situations you never want to be in when you do start investing in the Australian share market is in a situation where you have to sell shares just to cover your everyday life expenses, or something's gone wrong and you need to cover it. So for example, you've lost your job, unfortunate, sorry to hear that, but you'll need some money in that situation. You've got a major medical expense, a major car expense, a major travel expense. Maybe something's happened somewhere overseas and you have to quickly travel there to see a family member or deal with a situation. These are all events where you would need an emergency fund, or basically a bit of cash more than like the $500 that's hanging around your house. And if you don't have an emergency fund, your best alternative will probably be getting money out of your share market. You have to sell your shares. Now that introduces quite a few issues. The first one is if at any given time when you start investing in the share market, generally, it's entirely possible the share market hasn't gone up since you started investing. So your shares are probably sitting at a loss. And what you're doing is taking money out of your share market, actualizing those losses, realizing them, and then taking that to pay for something. So you've locked in the losses. Because remember, one of the great advantages of having money in the share market is you can always see how much it's worth. But one of the downsides is if it goes down 10%, you're really worried about it. But it's not really down 10% until you actually sell it. You haven't lost that money. It's just the state that it's in, really. That sounds like semantics, but it is a key thing to remember. The other reason is actually a more positive spin on things, but it actually can get very negative very quickly. And this is where, say you started investing in the share market. You've done really well. It's gone up 20, 30, 40, 50%. But it's still within a year of when you initially invested, and you have this emergency. And you think, oh, it's okay. I've got some money in the share market. It's gone up. I'll just take all that money out. I'll sell those shares and I'll use it to pay for my emergency. Now, what you've done is potentially inadvertently walked into a capital gains tax situation where you essentially have to pay tax on the profits that you made in the share market. But you're in this situation where you've used all the money and put it into this emergency. And let's say taxation time comes around and you report into the ATO all your movements of your money, the interest you made, and also the fact that you made a capital gains tax. So now you're in a situation where the ATO says, hey, you do need to pay this capital gains tax, right? We're going to tax it and you need to pay that. And you're like, but I put all the money away to my emergency. I don't have any extra money to pay for this. And now I'm going to introduce a little skit that I think will help translate the situation you're in. So you say to the ATO, I don't have the money. And they say, oh, you don't have the money. Oh, no worries, no worries. So you went headfirst into the share market, didn't have an emergency fund, had some great gains, had a catastrophic failure event occur in your life, had to take money out of the share market, didn't set aside any money for the capital gains, and now you're saying you can't pay any tax on it? Don't worry, no worries. We'll write it off, we'll let this one slide. It happens to all the starters. Not a problem. If you watched any kind of financial movie out there or any kind of really crime thriller out there, there are 3 organizations in the world that always get their money. The mafia, loan sharks, and the taxation department of any respective country. They will get paid. Now, I might have gone a little bit off topic here, but the key thing is make sure you do have money set aside in an emergency fund, because if something goes wrong, you don't want to be selling money out of the share market to then pay for something which you then might have a taxation liability, and it all goes downwards. I should also say, on a more serious note, I'm sure the ATO does have payment plans in place for people who can't immediately pay, and I'm sure there's quite a lot of time. I only said all that other stuff for comedic value. Not serious. Entertainment only. not even financial advice. Another key reason to have an emergency fund and not let it just be the shares that you keep is if you take money out of the share market in the middle of it growing and compounding, you lose those compounded gains. And the idea is you want to keep money in the share market for as long as possible over a long duration period of time so you can actually build up the gains over time. And you really, the money in your share market, it should only be traveling one way, in. Not in and out, in and out, in and out. Just in. Unless you're like Ray Dalio or Bill Ackman or this pro trader, then you can go in and out, in and out, in and out. But most people, I think just in is good. All right, so let's get on to how to actually build an emergency fund. Because you're probably thinking, what is this thing? Now, there are a couple of forms of an emergency fund, I guess. One is the simplest, and this is what I do, is just have cash on the side. So this is where you have a separate account, savings account, preferably maybe outside your normal ecosystem of accounts, just so it's not as easy to just take a little dip out of it, just to sort out a little small emergency, but it's not really an emergency. Have a separate account where you can just put money aside. Another way is you could do a term deposit, but I don't think this is wise because it needs to be on call. It needs to be easily accessible. And the issue with term deposits is you can't get that money easily without paying all these additional fees. So maybe avoid doing it in term deposit. Another common way to do it for people who have home loans is just to have extra money in your offset account. That makes total sense. Very wise idea. Now, to actually build the emergency fund, this can go through in a few ways. So one way can just be as you get paid, you just set aside a certain amount of money, you transfer it into your emergency fund. Another way is if you do actually have a payroll department for the company you work for, you can say, hey, I need to have a certain portion of my money go into this account. Like it just get automatically done. It's a bit of paperwork, but it will just naturally build it up. But you'll have to remember to turn it off, because otherwise then it'll just keep building up without you realizing. So be careful there. You won't get any pre-tax benefits. This is not like setting aside money into your super. It's all going to be done post-tax, but it does automate it and take it out of your sort of the front end of your brain to just get done automatically so you don't have to think about it. Now, how big should your emergency fund be? This is quite a common question. It's probably the most important question around it, and there's a lot of schools of thought around it. There's a lot of rules of thumb around it. It varies from having 3 months of your lifestyle expenses or your life expenses. So, 3 months of rent and bills and any other key things that you need to pay, maybe like, general groceries and all that. You package that number up, multiply it by 3, and you've got 3 months worth of that set aside. All the way up to having 6 months of salary set aside. And in between, you'll have like 3 months of salary, 6 months of expensive, 6 months of salary, all the way. There's a whole range that people will say on various websites, various things. Personally, I've found 3 months of salary is a good little, well, it's actually still quite conservative, because if you think about it, that's 3 months of salary. So that means you can lose your job but still have money coming in. And for me, that means I'll have money coming in to pay my bills and still invest in the share market. So really, if you assume I'm operating on, say, a 50% operating cost model, that means I'll actually have 6 months worth of living expenses. One thing I would do is put some smarts around it. So consider your situation, what you might need to have to cover. So for example, let's put one extreme. Let's say you're someone who lives at home and you don't have any kids, and like you live at home with your parents, you don't have any kids, you don't have any dependents, and you're a nurse. So you're highly employable. And you're in a situation where you're thinking, how big does my emergency fund need to be? Well, I'm thinking, well, you don't have a lot of expenses. You're in a highly employable job that even if for whatever reason you lose your job, you should be able to pick up another job somewhere else pretty quickly. Apologies if that's not always the case, but that's my assumption. That I wouldn't say you need a massive emergency fund. Obviously still think it through, but let's compare it to someone who has maybe, they're a little bit older in age. They're in a very niche kind of role or job in a very niche industry. It's very hard to find work if you lose that particular job. You've got a mortgage. You've got 15 children under the age of 3 or something like that. Then you're going to be in a situation where you'd probably need quite a large emergency fund, because not only would it be challenging for you to find work, potentially, apologies if it is, but it'd be challenging for you to find work, but you also have a lot of expenses that you just need to pay, but also all the dependents, all the people who are relying on your income may also have their own emergencies which you'd have to cover. So this is not to scare you, but it's just to say to you, put a bit of thinking around it, you know, just because it said on the internet you should have 3 months of expenses or 3 months of salary or 6 months. Think it through in terms of what it means for you and what kind of situations you might find yourself in. Then we get on to the topic around how do you maintain it? And it's essentially just remembering to keep an eye on it. Because number one, you don't want the money to get stolen if it's in a completely separate account, and say you get hacked and they just take money out. Then when you go in to have an emergency, there's no money there because someone's stolen it. You want to avoid that. So have some way of just checking in on your emergency account just to make sure the money's there and you've got strong passwords or whatever set up around it. Secondly, just remember to top it up. Because if for whatever reason you have to take $5,000 or $10,000 or whatever out of your emergency fund, make sure you remember to then get back into topping it back up again down the track. Because you don't want to, it's like if you have a spare tire in your car and you get a flat and you have to use your spare tire, but then you forget to replace the flat, then the next time you have a flat on your car, you'll be in the situation where you won't have a spare tire because all your spare tires will be all flat. Hopefully that analogy made sense. But that's the thing, is make sure you top up your emergency fund down the track. Once you have an emergency fund, it is an incredibly liberating feeling, really, when you can start investing. Even when you go to work and you know, hey, look, if things fall apart here, I've got 3 months of standby cash to kind of keep me ticking along. It can also avoid situations. Let's say you live in a house with other people, you've got housemates, and something like COVID happens again, and you're living with people who don't have an emergency fund. That would be challenging, I imagine, where you have to have those tough conversations around, well, how are you going to pay rent? What are you going to do? Are we all going to cover your rent? These kind of situations you do want to avoid. I should probably put this at the start of the video. And if you want to follow up with me on any of my other topics around personal finance and investing, or if you just want to have a chat about some of these topics, obviously I can't give any financial advice, but if you do want to set up that time, feel free to click on the Calendly link below and it'll go to a little schedule that you can then pick a time slot to set up and we can have a chat over the Zoom Skype thing. This video was actually part of another group of videos I was putting together around the whole idea of getting started in personal finance and investing and all these kind of exciting topics that I think everyday Australians should really be up to date on. I've got some links above to videos I've done on getting started in investing, like my 4 steps, mistakes that I've made that you can hopefully avoid, and you can stand on the shoulders of giants like other people and also maybe me. But you can do that and check out this video here and watch that. Otherwise, I will see you in the next video. Bye for now.